In recent months, the world geopolitical scenario has been marked by increasing tensions and complex negotiations, especially with regard to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. In a recent interview with Fox News, United States Vice President Vance expressed significant concerns about the duration and resolution of this conflict. According to Vance, despite diplomatic efforts and peace initiatives, war in Ukraine does not seem close to an outcome, highlighting the complexity and depth of the issues involved. Vance emphasized that conflict resolution will depend solely on Russian and Ukrainian decisions, noting that the United States, though influential, cannot impose a unilateral solution. This statement marks a subtle change in U.S. posture, which previously positioned themselves as active protagonists in peace negotiations. Now they adopt a more observant approach, recognizing the limitations of their direct influence on the outcome of war. The war, which began in 2022 with the Russian invasion, evolved into a trench conflict characterized by intense combat and territorial stagnation. Both sides face human losses and significant materials without decisive advances. This situation highlights the ineffectiveness of current diplomatic approaches and the need for new strategies to achieve peace. Despite the pessimistic discourse, the United States recently signed an economic agreement with Ukraine, ensuring preferential access to strategic natural resources such as lithium, rare lands, oil, and gas. This pact is seen as a form of indirect compensation for military and financial aid provided by the U.S. since the beginning of the conflict. In addition, it strengthens strategic ties between Washington and Kyiv, consolidating a long-term economic partnership. The agreement also aims to support the reconstruction of Ukraine, devastated by war, providing the necessary resources to revitalize its economy and infrastructure. At the same time, the United States ensures a privileged position in the exploitation of resources essential for their technology, defense, and energy industries, reducing dependence on other global suppliers, such as China. Vance attributed to President Donald Trump significant diplomatic advances, including obtaining formal peace proposals for both parties, something that had not occurred for 3 years. Trump, who during his campaign promised to end the war in a single day, now faces the reality of a complex conflict, where interests and resentments are deep and rooted. Negotiations remain locked due to the Russian requirement for international recognition of occupied territories, an unacceptable condition for Ukraine and the current international order. Symbolic attempts at ceasefire, such as the 3-day truce proposed by Putin, are seen with skepticism and classified as marketing gestures, with no real impact on the battlefield. Vance also questioned the human cost of the conflict, suggesting that it may not be worth continuing to fight small lanes. This comment reinforces Trump's recent criticism of Zelensky's stance, accusing him of maintaining an inflamed attitude that prevents the advancement of peace negotiations. For Trump, Ukraine faces a dilemma: accept a commitment now or risk losing even more territory in the future. The video concludes that the conflict is in a geopolitical limbo, where peace and victory seem equally unreachable. War has become a political and moral test for the United States and Europe, with Ukraine becoming a frozen front line between two world orders that refuse to give in. While the military scenario remains fought in battles without substantial advances, behind the scenes, the geopolitical dispute gains new contours. European analysts have pointed out that, besides the war in itself, there is an ongoing narrative war, where each movement in the diplomatic or economic field is calculated to project strength and weaken the opponent politically. In this context, the recent agreement between the United States and Ukraine proves to be not only a strategic but symbolic maneuver. He reinforces the idea that Kyiv, even in the midst of chaos, is still able to establish solid partnerships with global powers, ensuring his permanence in the international game. However, this kind of alliance also raises delicate questions. International relations experts warn that the promise of preferential access to natural resources may end up limiting Ukraine's sovereignty in the medium and long term. After all, in a country where most infrastructure are ruined and public coffers are overloaded for years of conflict, these economic concessions become the only possible way, even if, in other times, they were seen with distrust or even rejection. And then comes the central dilemma of this war: to what extent is it worth resisting without concessions? Zelensky, pressured by internal allies and Western leaders, maintains the firm speech that Ukraine will not accept to give up any portions of its territory. But this speech begins to find resistance, including among its historical allies. Countries like France and Germany have already shown, behind the scenes, signs of fatigue with the prolongation of war and would be willing to negotiate certain terms to end the conflict. However, this impatience is not universal. United Kingdom, Poland, and the Baltic countries continue to firmly support Ukrainian resistance, arguing that any concession to Russia can be interpreted as a sign of weakness and an invitation to future aggressions. This crack in the Western alliance further complicates the situation and shows that the united West against Russia is slowly fragmenting. J.D. Vance, during the interview, did not hide his frustration with this stagnation. He said it is a mistake to continue to feed the illusion of a clear and total victory, when the facts on the ground show that this outcome is increasingly distant. For him, the tough truth is that the war has become an unsustainable burden, and the only possible way out will be an imperfect peace, an agreement that displeases everyone, but allows the bloodshed. And when he says that, he touches a point that bothers leaders on both sides. No one wants to be the first to admit he lost. Russia, even facing brutal sanctions and evident military wear, still maintains control over significant parts of the Ukrainian territory. Already Ukraine, with support from the West, resisted more than anyone imagined, but now faces scarcity of ammunition, difficulty in recruitment, and an increasingly tired population of war. At the same time, the diplomatic field continues to skating. Attempts at intermediation made by neutral countries, such as Turkey and China, bump into mutual distrust between Moscow and Kiev. Not even multilateral meetings with emerging powers have had an effect. It seems that peace, if it comes, will be the result of a silent negotiation, made away from cameras, with many concessions and few public speeches. And it is precisely at this point that the figure of Trump returns to the center of the debate. For many, it represents the only leadership willing to break with the cycle of empty promises and seek direct agreement, even if it means making unpopular decisions. During his term, Trump was harshly criticized for his pragmatic posture in the face of authoritarian leaders, but now, ironically, this same pragmatism begins to seem a viable alternative to the current impasse. The fact is that conflict is no longer just about territories or sovereignty. He has become a mirror of the contradictions of the modern world. Powers divided between his declared values and his real interests, exhausted populations of power wars, and leaders arrested in discourses that do not support themselves in the face of the reality of battlefields. And perhaps, in this whirlwind of versions and interpretations, it lies with us simple spectators of this geopolitical tragedy. Try to understand what is really at stake. Does peace depend only on courage to give in? Or, as many fear, have we crossed the point without return, and now there is only the rubble of a diplomacy that failed? By this time, it is no longer who will win. The war has become an exercise in psychological resistance, where each side seems more concerned with giving in than to build real solutions. The numbers impress but no longer thrill. Thousands of dead, millions of displaced people, destroyed entire cities, and a trail of suffering that will hardly be erased in the next generations. And even in the face of all this, inflamed discourses are still heard by asking for more weapons, more sanctions, more sacrifices. The rhetoric of victory remains strong, but is increasingly disconnected from reality in the countryside. For many civilians, routine has become a silent battle, surviving with dignity amid abandonment, while leaders discuss pipeline routes, economic alliances, and reconstructions that may never come true. In practice, Ukraine is moving towards an uncertain future, where total victory is unlikely and full peace seems unreachable. The country, which once sought to integrate into Europe with hope and optimism, is now dependent on agreements that tie their economy to external interests and put their autonomy into check. It is too high for those who still try to keep a threatened national identity alive. And meanwhile, Russia, although advanced militarily in some regions, suffers internally from the weight of sanctions, capital escape, and growing diplomatic isolation. Putin, although still with considerable internal support, knows that he is far from an undisputed victory, and perhaps therefore maintains the strategy of continuous wear, hoping that time destroys the Ukrainian resistance without the need for a final attack. It is in this environment of exhaustion and cynicism that proposals of respite arise and disappear as smoke. Some, such as the 3-day break suggested by Putin, are seen as advertising maneuvers. Others, such as the discreet appeals of Western diplomats by a negotiated ceasefire, nor even gain headlines. Everything seems stagnant. The world powers, previously enthusiastic about the idea of supporting Ukraine in the name of freedom, now recalculate their own costs. The United States, even with the official unconditional support rhetoric, have redirected its interests. Attentions turn more and more to Indo-Pacific challenges with China for internal reconstruction. Ukraine runs the risk of becoming a forgotten war, one of so many, remembered only when it is appropriate or when it explodes some tragedy. And in this scenario, the figure of Trump reappears as a kind of catalyst for a new type of speech. By recognizing the limits of the current approach and suggesting that conflict could have been avoided with direct conversations and less geopolitical vanity, it breaks the dominant pattern. It is not just about criticizing Biden or the current administration, but proposing something that few are willing to say aloud. Perhaps it has been time to stop. Trump, who has always acted outside the traditional American foreign policy script, bets on the idea that the American people no longer want to play long and expensive wars, especially when there is no clear goal. And no matter how controversial, this reasoning begins to gain silent adhesion even among moderate analysts, who once saw war as an unenforceable moral struggle. The hardest thing is to accept that this war may never have had an ideal solution. From the beginning, tensions between Ukraine and Russia have been treated with ambiguity by the international community. The lack of clarity about NATO's boundaries, the hesitation to sanction Russia firmly in the early years, and the dispute over the separatist regions created a fertile field for the scalar conflict. Now it remains just to deal with the rubble of poorly calculated decisions and unfulfilled promises. What we see is a minefield, literal and symbolic, where each step requires painful renunciations. And in this soil poisoned by pride, pain and advertising, building any kind of reconciliation seems more difficult than ever. But if there is a lesson that can be taken from all this, perhaps it is the urgency to rethink the way the world deals with conflicts. For decades, global leaders promised that diplomacy was the strongest weapon of humanity. But at the slightest sign of disagreement, we return to bombs, drones, tanks. And what's left is destroyed families, devastated cities, and a youth marked by irreparable trauma. The question that remains is, how long will we accept this as normal? How long will we tolerate that war remains the plan B of leaders unable to listen? Maybe this video does not bring you all the answers, and that was not even the goal. The intention here is to provoke reflection, to expose what many prefer to ignore, and perhaps lead you to see beyond ready-made speeches. If you have gotten here, it is because this theme also touches you. And if it touched, I want to know what impacted you most in all this. Was it the hypocrisy of the leaders? The exhaustion of the Ukrainian people? Or do you realize that perhaps peace is less justice and more about courage to give up war?
The president was in the Vatican, had this iconic image talking to Volodymyr Zelensky in those two chairs and huddled down. A much different scene than when he was last in the White House, as you well know. Where do you see that? Is that going to come to fruition?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to give the president some credit here because there was a really big breakthrough and hasn't gotten that much coverage. But for 3 years, these sides have fought, and each of them has said, no peace, we're going to fight until the other guy is basically knocked out. What we've seen now in the last couple of weeks is each side has put down, this is our peace proposal. The Ukrainians did it, the Russians did it, and now I think the question is to see whether we can actually find some middle ground here for these guys to bring this conflict to a close. I really don't believe that any person, of the 8 billion people in the world, I don't think anybody could have gotten this deal done other than Donald J. Trump. When I say this deal, I mean getting these guys to actually propose a peace settlement, but it's going to be up to the Russians and the Ukrainians. Now that each side knows what the other's terms for peace are, it's going to be up to them to come to an agreement and stop this brutal, brutal conflict. It's not going anywhere, Brett. It's not going to end anytime soon. And I think for the Ukrainians, Yes, of course, they're angry that they were invaded, but are we going to continue to lose thousands and thousands of soldiers over a few miles of territory this or that way? I hope both of them come to their senses, and if they do, it will be because Donald J. Trump, I think, brokered one of the great peace deals of the 21st century.
I mean, you got the minerals deal. You got that signed. So you're optimistic.
Progress,
Can I say optimistic?
Look, I am optimistic, but it is ultimately, it's hard to say confident because the Russians and the Ukrainians, they're the ones who have to take the final step. We got them talking. We got them offering peace proposals. We got the minerals deal done. I think we're in a place where they've got to say, we're done with the fighting. We're done with losing thousands and thousands of young people. We're done with this. But only Russia and Ukraine can make that decision. That's not something even President Trump can do for them.